aging and wiser Robert McNamara returned to Vietnam in 1995, he conceded, somewhat in shock, that despite official U.S. estimates of 2 million Vietnamese dead, that 3.4 to 3.8 million Vietnamese had perished. In comparison, 58,000 Americans died in the fighting, and 200,000 were wounded. The U.S. had destroyed 9,000 of South Vietnam's 15,000 hamlets. In the north, all 6 industrial cities, 28 of 30 provincial towns, and 96 of 116 district towns. Unexploded ordnance still blankets the countryside. 19 million gallons of herbicide had poisoned the environment. Almost all of Vietnam's ancient triple canopy forests are gone. The effects of chemical warfare alone lasted for generations, and can be seen today in the hospitals in the South where Agent Orange was used. Dead fetuses kept in jars, surviving children born with horrid birth defects and deformities, and cancer rates much higher than in the North. And yet, incredibly, the chief issue in the United States was, for many years, the hunt for 1,300 soldiers missing in action. A few hundred of them presumed taken as captives by the North Vietnamese. Time and again, the curve of the ball might have broken differently. Gorbachev in 1986 with Reagan. It was a moment they could have signed off completely on nuclear arms. They were willing to give them up. Reagan, as crazy as he was, entertained the idea. And it was unfortunately the presence of Richard Pearl and a few other neoconservatives that talked him out of it. Why? Because Reagan was enamored of Star Wars, his fantasy of Star Wars, which never came true. They spent billions of dollars and never got it. But he said he could give up nuclear weapons, but he could not give up Star Wars. It's an interesting story. He negotiated a SALT II treaty with the Soviets, mandating a reduction in nuclear missiles and bombers. But Carter knew little about foreign policy and had been deeply influenced by the ideas of Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor. In June of '82, almost 1 million people rallied against the arms race in New York City's Central Park. Among them was a young Columbia undergraduate named Barack Obama. The movement unnerved Reagan, who saw it as a serious threat to his re-election. Despite all his bluster, Reagan too feared the possibility of war, which he associated with the biblical Armageddon. After watching the enormously popular 1983 ABC TV movie The Day After, Reagan wrote in his diary that it left me very depressed. Whether influenced by his wife or her astrologer, we don't know. But concerned about the bad blood he may have engendered, Reagan began to rethink his approach to the Soviet Union. Who had done so much to harm relations between the two countries, observed that the Soviet proposal was the best we have received in 25 years. Nitze and Secretary of State George Shultz urged Reagan to accept a sweeping arms control deal. Reagan turned to hardliner Richard Pearl, who feared such a deal would strengthen the Soviet economy. Pearl warned that the agreement would effectively kill Reagan's SDI, or Star Wars plan. Pearl and the other advisors knew Reagan's vision of SDI was a pipe dream, a fantasy. Only Reagan believed it would work. When negotiations stalled, Gorbachev urged Reagan to act boldly. Reagan shocked observers. It would be fine, he said, if we eliminated all nuclear weapons. Shultz agreed, but still, Gorbachev said he was ready to eliminate nuclear weapons if Reagan restricted SDI testing to the laboratory for 10 years. Gorbachev and Soviet scientists knew that FCI would do nothing to protect the United States from a full-scale Soviet attack, but feared U.S. moves to weaponize space and recoiled at the thought of giving up the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the only tangible constraint upon the arms race.
The heavens are for wonder, not for war. Stop Star Wars. Stop weapons in space.
Reagan, in the midst of this sordid affair, Gorbachev, wanting to salvage something, came to Washington in December '87 and signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, a major milestone. It was the first agreement ever to destroy an entire class of nuclear weapons, one in which the Soviet Union had superiority. If Reagan had entered into the sincere partnership offered by Gorbachev, as Roosevelt did with Stalin in World War II, the world would have been transformed. But Ronald Reagan, at the least, let the chance to rid the world of nuclear weapons slip through his fingers because he wouldn't let go of a space fantasy. Appreciating Gorbachev's extraordinary effort, a leading Soviet expert on the U.S. warned his American counterparts, "We will do the most horrible thing to you. We will leave you without an enemy." Unfortunately, he was wrong.
Redeeming Hitler.
Bush perhaps pondered his options, but he was neither a deep or bold thinker. Several times he had scorned what he called the vision thing, distrusting individualistic thinking. Like Harry Truman after World War II, he surrounded himself with anti-Soviet conservatives. Among them, Dick Cheney as his defense secretary and as his deputy national security advisor Robert Gates, the man who made his stripes as deputy to the fanatic William Casey. They all agreed reaching out to Gorbachev would weaken Western resolve. Whereas Gorbachev was calling for eliminating tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, an offer most Europeans applauded, the United States countered that the Soviet Union should remove 325,000 troops in exchange for a U.S. cut of 30,000. And while Bush neglected to pursue real progress with the Soviet Union, he wavered when hundreds of pro-democracy demonstrators were slaughtered in Beijing and Tiananmen Square by the People's Liberation Army. Condemning Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and Romania changed their governments without fear. On November 9, 1989, East and West Berliners jointly tore down the Berlin Wall, desecrating the Cold War's most reviled symbol. It was a grand moment, evidence of a new beginning. Yet many Americans hailed these actions as the ultimate vindication of the capitalist West after decades of Cold War. At Yalta in early 1945, on the eve of Germany's surrender, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill went a long way towards dividing Europe and Asia into Western and Soviet spheres of influence. This structure essentially lasted through proxy wars, near-nuclear conflagrations, intense propaganda and espionage activity for 45 years. Now this was all changing, and quickly. The Reagan administration had cozied up during the Iran war to Iraq's Saddam Hussein, turning a blind eye to his repeated use of chemical weapons, sometimes against his own people, made in part from U.S. supplied chemicals. When tensions flared between Iraq and oil-rich Kuwait, which had been part of Iraq until 1961, the U.S. ambassador personally assured Saddam that Bush wanted better relations and had no opinion on Iraq's border dispute. Hussein and tensions flared between Iraq and oil-rich Kuwait, which had been part of Iraq until 1961. The U.S. ambassador personally assured Saddam that Bush wanted better relations and had no opinion on Iraq's border dispute. Hussein took this as a signal from Bush, and the following week, with estimates of 250,000 troops and 1,500 tanks, took over Kuwait with little resistance. Long desiring a stronger footprint in the Middle East, the U.S. sent Secretary of Defense Cheney, General Powell, and General Schwarzkopf to meet with Saudi King Fahd to convince him to accept a large American military force as a buffer. When they showed the king apparently doctored photos of Iraqi troops and tanks at the Saudi border and even across it, the king, upset, reacted and asked for help. But at the same time, U.S. satellite photography had been edited to erase all signs that Iraqi forces were digging in with fortifications and trenches nowhere close to the border. There is no evidence that Hussein ever intended to invade Saudi Arabia. The deception was exposed when a Japanese newspaper obtained photos taken by a Soviet commercial satellite company showing no military activity near the border. Newsweek followed up, calling it the missing military presence. Pressure in November, Cheney warned that Iraq could have a nuclear device within a year and would likely use it. It was a card Cheney would play again in coming years. And by that time, over 560,000 U.S. troops were in the region. The total would reach 700,000. Schwarzkopf claimed the U.S. was facing a million-man Iraqi land force with high-quality Soviet tanks and openly willing to use chemical weapons. Operation Desert Storm, which began on January the 17th, 1991, by openly sending combat troops in huge numbers into a Middle Eastern country, marked the beginning of a new era in American geopolitics. It would take and laser-guided bombs. U.S. airstrikes pulverized Iraq's communications, military, and industrial infrastructure. On television, with U.S. and Saudi forces routing demoralized, poorly trained Iraqi troops from Kuwait. A new category of weapons made out of depleted uranium was born. Their radioactivity and chemical toxicity would produce cancers and birth defects. Victims would include U.S. soldiers who suffered mysteriously for years from what became known as Gulf War syndrome. Enough of the Republican Guard escaped the slaughter to ensure that Saddam would retain his hold on power. Bush and his advisor, the tough-talking Albright, insisted that Hussein's use of WMD was a greater threat to U.S. security. And on another occasion, she said quite openly, "If we have to use force, it is because we are America. We are the indispensable nation. We stand tall, and we see further than other countries into the future." Although the United States faced no clear threat from hostile nations, the Clinton administration proved even more tough-minded on defense than their Republican adversaries. Significant increase in U.S. arms sales to almost 60% of the world's market by 1997. Historian Chalmers Johnson summed up these years in 2004. In the first post-Cold War decade, we mounted many actions to perpetuate and extend our global power, including wars and humanitarian interventions in Panama, the Persian Gulf, Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, Colombia, and Serbia, while maintaining unchanged our Cold War deployments in East Asia and in the Pacific.